Unlike other card games, Magic has a ton of different ways you can play it. These formats each have their own card pools and occasionally their own rules for deck construction. So to help newer players with the way around the game, we're going to go over each of these formats, how and where to play them, and the pros and cons of each format, starting with the weakest formats and going to the strongest. Starting off with the weakest of all Magic formats, we have Limited, which is split into two different formats, Draft and Sealed. Limited is a format that's played by opening packs of Magic sets, as nearly every Magic set is designed to enable limited play. At an event, and building decks out of what you open, and playing with the deck for the rest of the event. This is different from other formats, called constructed formats, where you build your deck before the event, and have full control over what cards you get. The difference between Draft and Sealed is how the cards are divided up amongst the players. In a sealed event, each player is given a number of draft packs, usually 6, and they open those packs and build a 40-card deck with the cards they open, as well as with a number of basic lands, which should be provided by whoever is running the event. Because sealed, like all other limited formats, are so restrictive as to what cards you can play, there are special deck construction rules. As mentioned before, you only need 40 cards in your deck, but there also isn't a playset rule. So if you open 5 Typhoid Rats, you can play all 5 Typhoid Rats in your deck. Also, every card you open that you don't play is considered a part of your sideboard. So if you're playing a best 2 of 3 after the first game, you can take any number of cards out of your deck and replace them with any of the cards you opened, as long as you still have at least 40 cards in your deck afterwards. The other type of limited format is Draft. As opposed to Sealed, where you're given a number of packs and open them all by yourself, instead a pod of between 6 to 8 players sit around a table and each open one pack, take one card from it, and then pass all the cards to the players on the left. They repeat this until all the cards from the pack are gone, and they open the next pack and do the same thing. Once all the packs have been drafted, you build a deck out of the cards you choose. The same deck building rules with Sealed applied, so any number of basics, no playsets, and 40 card decks. Draft is generally more popular than Sealed for a few reasons. First off, it usually has a higher power level, as the process of drafting means that people will usually end up with a lot more cards than they can actually play in their deck. When you open a sealed pool, your pools will usually be evenly split amongst all 5 colors. Since you'll probably only be playing 2 colors, about 3/5 of all your pools won't be usable. In a draft, however, even though you're opening half as many cards, you'll be drafting way more playable cards, so your deck will be better overall. It's also more skill testing, as the process of drafting is its own skill that players have spent years getting better at. So, what are the pros and cons of Sealed and Draft? Some of the pros are that it's generally pretty cheap to buy in. Buying the packs needed to draft is usually around $12, and 6 packs for Sealed is usually just $24, which really isn't that much when you compare it to the cost of a full deck. And since every set is basically a whole new limited format, there's constantly new and interesting things to learn. Lots of the very weak cards that normally wouldn't see play are key parts of the limited environments. Limited is the place where commons and uncommons really shine. Additionally, every set also has its one mechanic specific to that set, and sometimes these cards don't transfer over to constructed formats where the power level is too high for them to compete. Limited is a great place to play with mechanics like Party or Dungeons, which didn't end up making a splash in Standard. The formats are also relatively low power level, which is either a pro or a con depending on what kind of gameplay you prefer. Some of the cons are the fact that you do have to buy new cards just about every time you try to play Limited, as you do need packs to open. So it's not like Constructed where you just buy a deck and you can play it whenever you want. You also need other people who are willing to draft with you, which can be harder than finding someone who just has a deck built. Not to mention that doing a draft can also take some time. Where can you play Draft and Sealed? You can play them at your local game store, on Magic Arena, or on Magic the Gathering Online. Moving on to the constructed formats, we're going to start off with Standard. Standard is, as the name implies, the standard Magic format, and what the majority of the releases are tailored to. Standard is Magic's only rotating format. How this works is that every year, Wizards will release 4 standard sets. Standard will always have 5 to 8 sets in it, and when the would-be 9th set is released, the oldest 4 sets rotate out. So you're playing with the last 2-ish years of cards released. Standard is played with the typical deck building rules, play sets of 4 for everything except for basic lands, 60 card deck, and 15 card sideboards. What are the pros of Standard? Standard is the primary format Wizards designs cards for, so it's usually more balanced than a lot of the other formats. It being a rotating format helps keep things interesting. New decks are always coming out, and older, annoying decks that you've gotten tired of will rotate out eventually. It also is a very creature-based format, where combo decks are rare, so if that's the kind of Magic you want to play, it's the best format for that. It's also the second cheapest constructed format, as all the cards have been printed recently, so there's ample supply for the demand. What are the cons of Standard? Rotation means you'll have to buy a new deck every couple of years, at least. It can also have a bit of a turbulent meta, as having such a small card pool can lead to there not being answers for certain threats or strategies. Where can you play Standard? At local game stores, on Magic Arena, and on Magic the Gathering Online. Next up, we'll be doing the Arena formats, or formats that are mainly played on Magic Arena. First up is Alchemy. Alchemy is basically Standard, but with some special Arena-only cards that do things that you can't do in paper, like permanently changing the stats of a card, even if it gets shuffled into the library or something, and balance patches instead of the ban list. These new cards are released as special versions of sets a little after their release. What are the pros of Alchemy? Due to there not being a ban list, you don't have to worry about your deck being banned out from underneath you. Even if they do get nerfed, they'll still be somewhat playable. It also has the same upsides and downsides of being a rotating format as Standard. What are the cons of Alchemy? Well, if your deck gets nerfed and the deck is made bad enough to not be able to see play anymore, you won't get your wild cards back, unlike with a banning. Now, we're trying to be objective here, but it is worth mentioning that the community generally doesn't like Alchemy very much, so there will be less resources available if you try to build a deck or look for metagame data. Where can you play Alchemy? You can play Alchemy only on Magic Arena. The next format is Historic. Historic is a format that uses standard deck construction rules and consists of every card that's on Magic Arena, besides the banned cards, of course. This includes every card in Standard that has gone through Standard, and some other cards that Wizards has added through Historic anthologies and remaster sets, as well as the digital-only cards. What are some of the pros of Historic? There's no rotation, so your deck will never rotate out. You can also use all of your old cards that aren't in Standard anymore. If you happen to really like a deck while it was in Standard, you can play it in Historic after it rotates, though you'll need to upgrade it quite a bit to make it more competitive. What are some of the cons of Historic? Historic isn't what Wizards has in mind when they print sets, so you'll get cards that are far too good for the format but not great at Standard, or sets with nothing strong enough for the format. This is something that's true of every non-rotating format, so I'll quickly mention it a few more times in the video. The higher power level means that weaker decks have an even harder time competing, though this will be true of all higher power level formats. The higher power level means that decks can also be harder to get the cards for, as they're more likely to be higher rarity. Where can you play Historic? Historic is exclusive to Magic Arena. The next format is Explorer. Explorer is basically just Historic, but without the digital exclusive cards. It uses standard deck construction rules and includes every card in Arena. So in summary, Standard is a rotating format without digital cards. Alchemy is Standard with digital cards, Explorer is non-rotating format without digital cards, and Historic is a non-rotating format with digital cards. What are the pros of Explorer? Similar to the pros of Historic, so your deck won't rotate out, and you can play with all of your old cards. What are the cons of Explorer? Again, the format is similar to Historic, so it has the same issues where weaker decks not being able to compete as easily, and decks sometimes being harder to get the cards for, as well as Wizards not balancing the standard sets around a format. Where can you play Explorer? Explorer is also exclusive to Magic Arena. The final Arena format is Historic Brawl. This is a format that has unique deck building rules, unlike the rest of the constructed formats we mentioned so far. In Historic Brawl, you can only play one copy of each card besides basic lands, so it's what's called a singleton format. You also have a 99 card deck as opposed to a 60 card deck, and players start at 25 life as opposed to 20. You also get to choose one legendary creature or planeswalker as what's usually called a commander, named after the commander format, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This commander starts outside your deck in the command zone, and you can cast it from the command zone as if it were in your hand. Anytime it would leave the field, you return to the command zone to play it again, but you have to pay 2 extra mana to play it again. Additionally, you can only play cards that are of the same color identity as your commander. Color identity is basically the color of a card plus all the colors of the mana symbols that appear in the card's text. So a card like Joda, Archmage Eternal, is a blue, white, and red card, but has a color identity of all 5 colors because there are all 5 mana symbols in its text. And as the name implies, the format has the same card pool as Historic, so any card in Arena can be played in Historic Brawl, though both formats have their own ban list, and there are different cards in the 2 ban lists. What are the pros of Historic Brawl? Brawl is a more casual format, and the higher life total and less consistent decks allows more expensive cards to be viable without making the format extremely weak. It also lets you build around any legendary creature or planeswalker you want, which leads to a very different deck building process. You can play cards specifically because they synergize with your commander, whereas in other formats you wouldn't know that you'd have access to that card. This means people build decks more synergizing with a certain theme, rather than just playing all the best cards they have access to. For example, if you're playing a legendary creature like Falco Spara Pact Weaver as your commander, you'll be playing lots of cards that synergize with counters to make the most of his ability. What are the cons of Historic Brawl? Games of Historic Brawl are often very grindy and long due to their higher life total, which can be a negative. It's also a less competitive format, so there aren't big competitive events for the format if you're looking for that. Where can you play Historic Brawl? Historic Brawl is exclusive to Magic Arena. Now that we're done with the Arena formats, we're moving on to Pioneer. Pioneer is an eternal format that includes every card that's been in Standard, starting from Return to Ravnica, printed in 2012, and including all of the Standard cards since then. It uses the normal deck building rules, 60 card deck, playset of 4 cards, and a 15 card sideboard. It's worth mentioning really quickly that non-standard set releases, like Commander, Legends, do not go into Pioneer. What are some pros of Pioneer? Pioneer is basically the Historic or Explorer for Paper and Magic Online. It has the upsides of not rotating at a higher power level, as well as getting to use your favorite old Standard cards. What are some of the cons of Pioneer? It is usually a bit pricier than Standard to buy into, because all the cards are older and often are played in other formats, meaning they're both less supply and a higher demand, driving up prices. And like other non-rotating formats, Wizard isn't designing around Pioneer. Where can you play Pioneer? You can play Pioneer at your local game store and on Magic Online. Next, we have Pauper. Pauper is a non-rotating format with the normal deck construction rules, but instead of including every card in a set rotating from 1 point forward, it includes every common card in every set. It also includes side sets, unlike formats like Pioneer and Modern, which only include standard sets. What are the pros of Pauper? Pauper is by far the cheapest constructed format. It also doesn't have a rotation, so after you build a deck, you won't ever have to get a new one. This makes it an even cheaper format to play. What are the cons of Pauper? Only having commons means that some effects are missing from the format. It doesn't mean the format is necessarily weak, as more than enough strong commons exist for it to be around the same power level as Pioneer. It just means that some splashy effects, like extra turn spells, don't exist in the format at all. It's also not the most popular format, so you have a little bit of trouble finding games. Where can you play Pauper? You can play Pauper at your local game store and on Magic Online. The next format is Modern. Modern is a non-rotating format that uses the standard deck construction rules and includes all the cards that have gone through Standard, starting with 8th edition printed in 2003, as well as the cards printed in Modern Horizon sets. Remember, the only side sets that are included in Modern are Modern Horizon cards. Things like Commander Legends do not go into Modern. What are the pros of Modern? Modern has both a very high power level and a very diverse metagame, especially when compared to formats like Standard. It also has combo strategies that wouldn't be fair in weaker formats available. It also has a very diverse metagame with aggro, combo, mid-range, and control decks all having their own niches. If you want a format where Mono Red Burn can compete with some of the wildest combos in the game, Modern is great for that. What are some of the cons of Modern? Modern is very expensive because the cards that see play are even stronger than in formats like Pioneer. There are less viable cards, the cards are older, and more people need these specific cards, meaning there's even lower supply of the cards and an even higher demand. Where can you play Modern? You can play Modern at your local game store and on Magic Online. The next format is Commander. Commander is what Historic Brawl is standing in for on Arena. You have a 99 card deck with only 1 copy of each card besides basic lands, and a Commander, which is specifically a legendary creature, not a planeswalker like in Historic Brawl, and all your cards had to be within the creature's color identity. Players also start with 40 life instead of 20. Commander is also one of the only multiplayer focused Magic formats, usually played in pods of 4, but you can play it with other numbers of players. What are the pros of Commander? Commander is a non-rotating format, so you don't have to build new decks if you don't want to. You also get to build your deck around a legendary creature, which opens up different deck building options. The higher starting life total also makes more expensive cards more viable. Commander is also the most popular Magic format, so it's pretty easy to find games. What are the cons of Commander? The format is very casual, so there aren't competitive tournaments for it. Players can often disagree what the power level of the format should be played at, which can lead to lopsided games. On top of that, Commander can be a very unbalanced format at times. Combo decks are far stronger than aggro, mid-range, and control decks, which really compounds the lopsided nature of some games as one player goes off and wins and no one else happens to draw an interruption to stop them. Where can you play Commander? You can play Commander at your local game store or on Magic Online. The next format is Legacy. Legacy is a format with standard deck building rules and where every card that has ever been released is legal, except for the banned cards, of course. This includes cards in non-standard sets, such as Commander Legends, or even Commander Precons and the like. What are the pros of Legacy? It's a non-rotating format and it has the highest power level of any format with a ban list. This makes some of the most complex and interesting games of Magic you can play. There were combo decks that can kill you on turn 1, tons of 0 mana spells, very powerful stack cards, fast mana, just about every busted effect ever printed, so while the cards that are playable are more selective, there's a more varied set of strategies that are viable. Other formats simply can't allow these strategies to exist because the tools aren't there to deal with them. For example, FTK, or first turn kill decks, are banned in every format except Legacy and Vintage, because formats like Modern don't have 0-mana interactions necessary to keep them in check. What are the cons of Legacy? Legacy is very, very expensive, far more so than Modern. Lots of important cards in the format are on the reserved list, meaning Wizards can't reprint them, leaving staples at hundreds of dollars a copy. Additionally, aggro isn't quite good enough to compete, and it's a bit rare in the format. So if you're a big fan of burn decks, maybe stick to Modern or Pioneer. Where can you play Legacy? You can play Legacy at your local game store or on Magic Online. The last format is Vintage. Vintage is Legacy, but instead of a ban list, you have a restricted list where cards are limited to 1 copy instead of banned. What are the pros of Vintage? Vintage is the strongest format in all of Magic, and it's not even close. If you want to see what Magic at its most powerful is like, look no further than Vintage. What are the cons of Vintage? It is ungodly expensive. I know I've said that a lot, but nothing compares to Vintage. Going off of MTG Goldfish, Blue Tinker, the best deck in Vintage right now costs $86,478 in paper. This is several orders of magnitude more expensive than any other format. Where can you play Vintage? You can theoretically play it at your local game store, but realistically you're playing it on MTGO, where the cards aren't the price of a car. And those are the most important MTG formats. There are a few other formats as people make up their own from time to time, but most of them don't last very long. So these are the most common ways people play Magic.